Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Podcast Digest, Mac and Mike. I want to thank you for downloading this week's The Podcast Digest. You might be thinking this episode is a little bit early, and you would be right. Episode 3 was just a few days ago, and before I talk about why you're receiving episode 4 so soon, I want to talk a little bit about episode 3. It really was a spectacular showing in the download numbers, at least for me, at least this early on in the process, in the life of The Podcast Digest. So I want to thank you very much for sharing this with a friend, telling folks about it. There's been an awesome reception on Twitter. You can follow me there if you're not already at Pod Digest. 2 shows that I talked about last week, the That'll Play Pod as well as How Is This Movie? Both those shows shared links that I had put out there for episode 3, and I want to thank those listeners as well of those shows for joining me here on the Podcast Digest. It's really been great. So why are you receiving episode 4 already? Well, a very simple reason. If you listen back to episode 1, I did make mention in there that I am also a mobile DJ. And up to this point, I've been releasing episodes on Sunday mornings. It had been up to this point a very convenient time for me to release new shows. However, in the next couple of months, I have a lot of weddings to DJ on Saturday afternoons and evenings, and I don't want to make a commitment that I cannot hold to in terms of delivering a new episode on Sunday. Quite frankly, I may not want to get out of bed a couple of those Sundays given some of the long days I have ahead of me for the weekend. So this is a quick week, quick turnaround for episode 4. I hope that you enjoy. And for the next couple of months, probably through Thanksgiving or so, I'm looking to have midweek releases. So episode 5 should still be a week or so from now, mid next week. But let's talk about some of the things that I had mentioned in episode 3. In my listener pro tip section, the opening section of each show here on the Podcast Digest, I had mentioned that I wanted to hear from all of you on how you listen to podcasts, sort of where you do it, what you use to do it, and maybe share with everyone else your experiences. Well, I did have somebody share with me their experience, and it's another podcaster, which I think is great. Jerry from the IOSDocked podcast shot me an email, and that email is thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. He did mention to me in that email, and I want to thank him for pointing this out, that I may not have mentioned my name enough. My name is Dan Lizette, folks, so if you shoot me an email or you want to address me personally, my name is Dan, and I'll be happy to get back to you on any of those points of contact. But back to Jerry's feedback, who he is another podcast host, so I take his input pretty seriously in terms of the way that he consumes podcasts. He says to me in his email that he does listen on his daily commute on public transportation. He does use Apple's podcast app and the Beats Power Beats headphones. On the weekend and at home, he will listen again on the podcast app on his iPad using the Bose SoundLink Mini Bluetooth speaker system, or in the car on the weekends, he will use his Bluetooth and USB connection. He did mention that the USB connection in his car can read the Apple Podcast playlist and allows him to select a podcast using his native car interface, which he says is better than having to futz around with a smartphone while driving. Definitely agree with you there, Jerry. And also when he's going on his walks or biking excursions, he has his podcasts with him. He points out that there are many different applications that you can use to listen to podcasts, and we covered some of those last week, but he prefers Apple's podcast app because of its integration with his car system as well as the Siri integration using commands like Siri Play Podcast. So that is Jerry at IOSDocked Podcast's preference for listening to his shows that he subscribes to. And some good perspective. I didn't talk too much about the Apple Podcasts app. I probably should, because if you happen to be listening to this tonight, which is a Tuesday evening, you may not have it yet, but starting tomorrow, you will. On Wednesday, September 17th, iOS 8 is released to the iOS world, and the Podcasts app will be pre-installed in iOS 8, could not be deleted by any user. And this should be a boon for all podcasts podcasts. And if you are already a podcast fan, and then I know you've had this experience where there are friends or family members who have no idea what a podcast is. iOS 8 and having the podcast app installed by default will allow you to at least say, really, pull out your phone. Let me show you this icon. That's what podcasts are. Oh, really? I didn't know what that was. So on and so forth. So I think all of us probably need to take another significant look at the Apple Podcast app if you've not done so already. I did a while back and did dismiss it because I didn't feel like it met all my needs. While I don't see myself switching from Pocket Casts anytime soon, I do believe it might be worth another look, just because I know that many of you will be using that application, and I want to make sure that I can tell you how to find all of these great shows that I recommend each week. Speaking of which, that's the perfect segue to talk about shows that I'm recommending this week. And I'll be honest with you guys, the shows I'm recommending this week, because I knew that this would be a short week, only a few days since I last published, I wanted to go back to a couple of shows that I have been listening to for years. One of my goals here with the Podcast Digest is to find a lot of new shows that I've not originally been introduced to, that I've come across through some research or through recommendations on Twitter or through the website, thepodcastdigest.info, that you guys leave comments for and ask me to check out these other shows. And a couple of the ones I've done reviews for already, you have recommended to me, and they've been great, and they've really expanded my knowledge of the amazing quality of shows that are out there across the land. And I look forward to doing that. But with the short turnaround this time, I wanted to go with what I know, so to speak. So the two shows I have for you, I have literally been listening to for years and years and years. So let's begin first. As I mentioned already, you guys know that I am a huge Apple fan. I own an iPad. I'm recording right now on a MacBook Air. And of course, I have an iPhone. So one of the shows I came across right from get-go was my first recommendation this week, which is macOS Ken. Many of you may have heard of macOS Ken, but if by chance you are here listening to this show and you've not had a chance to listen to macOS Ken, and you like Apple, or even if you don't and you just want to understand what's going on in the world of Apple and technology in general, I urge you to listen to Ken Ray's show, macOS Ken. This show's been around since 2005 or 2006, so it is one of the granddaddies of podcasts. It has been an early entrant in the podcast world, and this show comes out every single weekday without fail. The fact that Ken can issue a new episode every day, every weekday, is extraordinarily impressive. These shows last about 15 to 25 minutes each day. It is chock full of information. And it is one of the shows really that a lot of the Apple pundits, a lot of the people you see on MacBreak Weekly or some of the analysts, they listen to Ken Ray's macOS Ken show. Ken will go over news related to Apple, the iPhone, iPad, the Mac, product releases, any rumors that are going on, the performance of the Apple business as a whole, news from the financial sector. It is just a whole rash of information up and down the spectrum. And again, if you are an Apple fan of any sorts, check this show out. This show has a ton of production value. And again, it's amazing given the turnaround, how quickly Ken Ray can issue these new shows. Ken has recently been branching out, and you will often hear him if you listen to Apple-related podcasts, as I mentioned, like MacBreak Weekly or Adam Christensen's MacCast. Ken is regular guests on both of those shows. Ken also now has started to widen his offering. He is now packaging up his daily show, including some of the links or the photos or the images, and even including some commentary in a new iOS newsstand offering he is calling iChart Magazine. That's EYE Chart Magazine. I've not yet subscribed to, only because I'm such a committed every morning listener to macOS Ken. But if you prefer the written word, or you would just like a repository of all the great information that Ken shares each day, iChart Magazine would be an excellent resource for you to sit back and enjoy in sort of that newspaper or magazine format. available there on the iOS newsstand. Ken also offers a premium subscription that he calls Day 6, and that's exactly what you might think it is. A slightly different formatted show available on Saturdays, the 6th day of the week, where he really does interview-based type shows or discussion-based shows, diving in even deeper with some of the topics that are of note in the Apple world. This show is absolute required listening, in my opinion, to any Apple fan. And if that is you and you are not listening to macOS Ken yet, please subscribe. You can follow the host Ken Ray on Twitter. It's at macosken. You can check out his website, macosken.squarespace.com, and to get all the information about subscribing or about Ken himself. Our second show recommendation this week is also something that I've been listening to for years, and also represents one other thing that I want to try to do here on the Podcast Digest. Over time, what I want this show to be is a central repository for all the best shows here on the web. I heard a number the other day that it's almost 500,000 podcasts right now listed in the iTunes library or the Stitcher radio library. That is a lot of shows for any of you to be expected to comb through, to search for, to check out the charts or other websites to try to find out what the best shows are. So I want the Podcast Digest to be able to be what that is the place to go to find. To do that, I want to make sure to represent the full gamut of listening, and that's going to take me some time. I'll be honest with you, there are some genres that I've not touched upon before with my personal subscriptions. It will take me some time to dive into those, and I want to give them a 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 episode listen before I want to come here and tell you if they're worth your time and subscription. So as I mentioned, though, this is a short week, so I'm going back to something I know, and I'm going to be touching upon my first recommendation in the sports world. I am a big sports fan. Baseball, basketball, football are my three-pronged loves, especially baseball. But to get my daily dose of sports, I found at first that podcasts were a little tough to do that, because who can cover in any given day everything that happened in the sports world yesterday? I mean, there is 3, 4, 5, 6 hours of programming every morning on ESPN and SportsCenter just running through the highlights. And these are just the highlights of all that occurred in the sports world. The reality is you would need dozens of podcast subscriptions to be able to get a true picture of what you may have missed last night in the sports world. And that's really not possible, especially with all the other subscriptions that I've told you that you need to take a listen to. There needs to be an easier and better way of doing that. And I've got that recommendation for you right here and now. It may not be a surprise to you that my second show recommendation is the best of Mike and Mike. Most of you, if you have any interest in the sporting world, have heard of Mike and Mike in the Morning. It's a regular morning show, if you will, radio-style morning show on ESPN2. It goes from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and it is, a two-person co-host interview panel and a summary of all the biggest issues in the sports world. But did you know they have a podcast? Yes, they do. I don't know about you. I have a day job, and I'm not able to spend the first 4 hours of my morning listening to a sports show. It would be great, but it is not in my current ability to do that. Well, I came across the podcast, Mike and Mike, the podcast. They do some great editing every day and deliver to you anywhere from a 45-minute to maybe an hour, 10-minute version that is basically the best interviews, the best exchanges, the best conversations from the 4-hour morning show. It's usually in the feed about 1:30 in the afternoon Eastern again, and it allows me to catch up with the day's events that they discuss the morning, allows you to stay current with the water cooler conversations or conversations in the break room or around the copier of the office of the current goings on in the sports world. There are a few commercials in the show, but not many, usually just one at the very beginning or end and some live reads that Mike and Mike may do. But before I get too far into telling you about this show, who are Mike and Mike? This, of course, is Mike Greenberg and Mike Golic. It's a really interesting setup that they have. It is sort of the super jock talking to the super fan, with Mike Golic being a former NFL football player and Mike Greenberg being sort of the lifetime super fan. He is a huge New York Jets fan. Don't hold that against him. I try not to. But he also brings that perspective that is a great yin to Mike Golic's yang. And just listening to their back and forth every morning is an awesome sight to hear, if that makes any sense. Now, this isn't Sports Center, and what I mean by that is you're not going to hear a ton of game scores, box score info. You do get some of that, but what you hear are the most important of those, the most talked about games, the most talked about plays, and whatever you really need to know in the sports world. They also present some really cool recurring segments, their annual picks for the March Madness tournament called Sheet of Integrity, their NFL football picks they call the Stone Cold Lead Pipe Locks, and there's a lot of information that is packed into each and every one of these shows. I listen to it regularly. I feel like I'm caught up in the sports world when I do. And again, if you have any interest in sports, you need to be listening to Mike and Mike. There's not much else to highlight here with this show. Most of you have heard, if you have any interest in sports, as I said, of Mike and Mike, and of course of ESPN or ESPN2. But I do want to make one statement here. Some of you thinking right now, maybe, how can you be recommending, a show like Mike and Mike? That is such a huge show. What about all the little guys, all those 500,000 shows that are out there? And you're right in some ways. I do intend with the Podcast Digest to highlight a lot of the more obscure shows that you would need to know about, or I'd like you to know about, because they're great entertainment. That said, I also believe that entertainment's a very personal choice and decision. Whatever you're into is what you're into. And if you're into sports, the big guys may be able to provide you a great experience for that. I know the Mike and Mike show does that for me. There are any number of amazing sports podcasts out there, and I intend in the future to be sure that I highlight some of those smaller shows that I think are doing great work. But I also want to make sure that I'm delivering recommendations to you that are of the best quality, the best version of time spent with your earpods on, if you will. Your listening time to me is valuable. And I know that if you like sports, Mike and Mike, this podcast from ESPN, will deliver a quality, entertaining, informative product to you. And that, above all else, is my desire here on the Podcast Digest, to make sure that I'm giving you quality, entertaining, informative recommendations that I think you should subscribe to. So if this does do it for you from a sports standpoint, please subscribe. And then after that, go take a little deeper look inside the catalog, or better yet, take a listen to another episode of the Podcast Digest and find some other shows that will also be of that same quality. So that'll do it. Before I go, I want to just make a couple quick mentions. I had my second review on iTunes, another 5-star review from The Do-Over. They also have a podcast as well. Look it up in iTunes, The Do-Over, DEW. Over. Thank you very much for the review of the Podcast Digest. If you've not had a chance to leave a review in iTunes, there is really little you could do to help me more than leave a 5-star review there on iTunes if you're enjoying each week's new episode of the Podcast Digest. Don't forget to check us out on TuneIn Radio. Listen to us in the Stitcher application, which is available everywhere. Check out my website. I'm starting to do a few more post updates there at thepodcastdigest.info. Find me on Twitter if you didn't find me there already, at Pod Digest. And thank you all very much for tuning in to episode 4 of the Podcast Digest, and I will see you again next week.